The tragic end of Linda Christian, the actress who moved among nobles. She was born Blanca Rosa Welter in 1923, not under the Hollywood sign but in the tropical heat of Tampico, Mexico, a city of oil millionaires and revolutionaries, of sticky nights and sudden storms. Her father was a Dutch-born engineer, her mother a Mexican socialite of European descent. From the beginning, Linda Christian lived between worlds, European refinement and Latin fire, old money and new uncertainty. By the time she was 12, the family had fled the Mexican Civil War, washing ashore in the United States like refugees wearing silk dresses. They moved 16 times in 10 years. Blanca learned to reinvent herself before she understood what reinvention cost. She was educated in Switzerland, presented in Paris, married briefly to a Spanish nobleman who lost his fortune at cards. All of this before her 20th birthday. Dorothy Lamour's sarong. Rita Hayworth's hair flip. Linda Christian had something else, the ability to make aristocrats forget their titles and tycoons forget their wives. She was not a great actress, she admitted as much in her unpublished memoirs, but she was a great presence. When she walked into the El Morocco nightclub in 1944, David O. Selznick reportedly dropped his cigar. "That woman," he said, "is a moving painting." MGM put her in Technicolor musicals and costume dramas, always as the exotic second lead, the one who lost the hero but won the audience. She played opposite Errol Flynn, who tried to seduce her in his dressing room. She outlasted Lana Turner in rehearsals. She befriended Ava Gardner, who warned her, "They'll use you until you crack, honey. Then they'll find another face." But Linda wanted more than stardom. She wanted the life, the one she glimpsed in the chateaus of her Swiss schoolmates' parents, the one her mother described as moving among people who do not check prices. In 1949, she got it. She married Tyrone Power, the most elegant leading man in Hollywood, a man whose pedigree Irish nobility, stage royalty mattered to her more than his paycheck. For a few years, they were the golden couple, he in tailored suits, she in Dior, photographed at Cannes, Rome, Acapulco. They visited the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, danced at the Cielo in Venice, bought a villa in Jamaica. But Power was secretly exhausted by her need for social ascent. She loved the idea of being a princess more than she loved him, a friend later said. The marriage collapsed in 1955. Linda kept the villa. Power kept the career. The 1960s were cruel to actresses of her kind. She was too old for ingenues, too exotic for matron roles, too expensive for television. But she refused to disappear. Instead, she doubled down on the world that had always welcomed her, European nobility. She became the companion of Prince Igor Trubetskoy, then Baron von Pantz, then a series of fading counts with large titles and small bank accounts. By 1970, Linda Christian was living in the Hotel de Crillon in Paris, not as a guest, but as a resident of a rented suite she could no longer afford. She sold stories to gossip columns for cash. She pawned her jewels one by one, the Cartier watch from Power, the emerald ring from the Baron, the pearl earrings from a Saudi prince who never called again. Her daughters, Romina and Tyrone, tried to help. Romina, who would later become a successful singer, remembered finding her mother at 3 in the morning, fully dressed in a gown and gloves, preparing for a party that did not exist. "Mama, the party is over," Romina said. Linda looked at her without recognition. "Not for me," she answered. On July 22, 1982, Linda Christian died in a small apartment above a garage in Tiburon, California, a town of wealthy retirees who had never heard of her. The cause was colon cancer, but the tragedy was not the disease. The tragedy was the silence. No studio sent flowers. No prince flew in. Tyrone Power had been dead for nearly a quarter century. Her daughters were in Europe, unreachable for hours. She was found by a housekeeper who had worked for her for only 2 weeks. On the nightstand, A framed photograph of Linda at the Cannes Film Festival, 1952, wearing a white chiffon dress, Prince Rainier of Monaco kissing her hand. Next to it, a check for $47.63, her entire savings. And a letter, never mailed, addressed to whoever finds this. It read, "I was not a great actress, but I was a great witness. I saw the last moment when beautiful people still wrote letters, still wore gloves, still believed in love as a kind of architecture. After me, everyone became efficient. I am glad I was inefficient. I am glad I was late to every appointment. I am glad I chose the wrong men. It made the right rooms so much more interesting." She was buried in a modest plot in Holy Cross Cemetery, Colma, California, not far from the mausoleums of the stars she once outshone. Her headstone says only, "Linda Christian, 1923 to 1982, beloved mother." No mention of MGM. No mention of princes. But on certain foggy afternoons in Tiburon, locals say, an elderly woman in a Dior gown can be seen walking toward the bay, her feet bare, her hair undone, ready for a party that started 50 years ago and never really ended. The MGM contract and the noble obsession. The morning Linda Christian signed her contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, she wore a cream-colored suit she had borrowed from a hotel heiress and pearls she had not yet paid for. It was 1944. The war was ending. Hollywood was hungry for new faces, especially faces that reminded men of places they had never been. Linda's face did that. It was not the all-American cheerleader of Betty Grable nor the sultry homework of Rita Hayworth. It was the face of a woman who had already lived 3 lives and was not sorry for any of them. Louis B. Mayer met her in his office, a room that smelled of cigar smoke and old leather and the quiet terror of every actor who had ever sat in the guest chair. He did not stand when she entered. He looked at her for a long time, then at her test photographs, then back at her. "You're not pretty," he said. "You're something else." Linda smiled. She had learned early that men like Mayer did not want to be argued with. They wanted to be mystified. "What am I, Mr. Mayer?" "Expensive," he said. And he wrote her a check. The contract was standard for the time, 7 years, option periods, a salary that started at $250 a week and would climb. Slowly if she behaved and quickly if she slept with the right people. Linda intended to do neither. She intended to marry above the studio system entirely. But first, she needed the system. The system gave you visibility. Visibility gave you invitations. Invitations gave you dukes. The education of a Hollywood princess. MGM put her in acting classes with Lillian Burns, a tiny woman with a voice like a whip crack who had taught Lana Turner how to cry on cue and Judy Garland how to pretend she was happy. Lillian watched Linda's first scene, a simple monologue from a forgotten play, and said nothing for a full minute. "You move like a cat," Lillian finally said. "But you act like a fence post. We have work to do." Linda worked. She worked harder than anyone expected. She arrived at 6 in the morning to practice diction, because her Mexican accent still crept in on words like mirror which came out mirror and world which came out world. She stayed until midnight, watching Katharine Hepburn rehearse, studying Greer Garson's posture, counting the seconds between Gable's line readings. She was not the most talented actress on the lot. But she might have been the most determined student. Her first film was a small role in The Thrill of Brazil 1946, a musical so forgettable that even Linda later joked she had forgotten she was in it. She played a Brazilian socialite, typecasting of the laziest kind, but she wore a gold lame gown that cost more than her weekly salary, and when she descended a staircase in the third reel, the male lead forgot his next line. That moment, caught on film, became her calling card. She was not a performer. She was an apparition. MGM noticed. They gave her a better role in Green Dolphin Street 1947, opposite Lana Turner and Van Heflin. Linda played a French nun, a stretch for a woman who had not attended Mass since she was 16, but she brought to the role something no one expected: stillness. While Lana vibrated with mid-century anxiety, Linda stood in the corner of the frame like a candle in a dark room. Critics called her arresting. Lana called her "that bitch who doesn't blink." But Linda did not care about critics or co-stars. She cared about a photograph that had appeared in Vogue 3 months earlier, a picture of Prince Rainier of Monaco at a polo match in Deauville, standing next to a woman identified only as the Countess de la Fressange. Linda cut the photograph out and taped it to her mirror. Beneath it, she wrote in pencil, "This is your world. Not soundstages. Not Schwab's drugstore. This. The aristocracy of exile." What Linda Christian understood, and what most Hollywood actresses did not, was that the European nobility of the 1940s was a wounded animal ripe for seduction. The war had stripped away their lands, their titles were hollow, their bank accounts were Swiss fictions. But they still had the names. They still had the addresses. They still knew which fork to use. Linda had grown up among such people in Switzerland and Mexico and France. Her mother, Blanca Rosa Vorhauer, had been a celebrated beauty in her own right, a woman who had danced with the Prince of Wales before he abdicated and dined with Porfirio Diaz before he fled. She taught Linda the rules: never ask about money, always compliment the portrait of the grandmother, wear diamonds only after dark, and remember that a count who offers you a ride in his Rolls-Royce is probably borrowing the Rolls-Royce. By 1948, Linda had perfected the art of the European campaign. She would take a break from filming, a week, sometimes 2, and fly to Paris or Rome or Cannes. She would check into the Hotel de Paris or the Excelsior, always on the studio's dime disguised as location research. She would appear at cocktail parties wearing the same Dior dress 3 nights in a row, knowing that the right people would notice the dress, not the repetition. She met Prince Serge Obolensky, the Russian émigré who had married Alice Erstier. She met Count Rudolf von Schönberg, who had lost his castle but kept his wound. She met Baron Hubert von Pantz, an Austrian aristocrat with a glass eye and a collection of unpaid gambling debts. She did not sleep with them, not yet. She listened to them. She learned their histories, their grievances, their secret shames. And she stored every detail in a small leather notebook she kept in her handbag. "Americans think aristocrats are happy," she told a friend at the time. "They are not happy. They are haunted. That is what makes them interesting. And that is what makes them vulnerable." Tyrone Power, the prince she almost loved. Then came Tyrone Power. She met him at a party given by Darryl F. Zanuck in Bel Air, a sprawling Spanish-style mansion where the champagne was warm and the gossip was cold. Power was 33 years old, the biggest star at Fox, a man so handsome that his face had launched 1,000 ship jokes. He was also, secretly, miserable. His marriage to French actress Annabelle was crumbling. His career was a gilded cage. He wanted to be Hamlet, the studio wanted him to be Zorro. Linda walked into the party late, deliberately late, wearing a black velvet dress with a neckline that suggested everything and revealed nothing. Power was standing by the pool, alone, smoking a cigarette and staring at the water as if it held answers. She approached him from the side, not from behind, because she knew that beautiful men were always afraid of surprise. "You look like a man who has everything," she said. He turned. Later, he would tell friends that he forgot how to speak for 3 full seconds. "I have nothing," he said. "But I could be persuaded." They talked for 4 hours. They talked about Ireland, his mother's homeland, where his family had once been nobility before the English took everything. They talked about Mexico, her father's adopted country, where she had learned that beauty was a weapon and a curse. They talked about fame, about loneliness, about the difference between being adored and being known. By the end of the night, they were holding hands under the table like teenagers. But Linda was not a teenager. She was 26 years old, and she had learned from her first disastrous marriage to a Mexican doctor named Charles Welter, a union so brief and so stupid that she later erased it from her official biography, that love without position was just theater. She needed Tyrone Power to be more than a movie star. She needed him to be her entry into the world that had been promised to her since childhood. "I will marry you," she told him 3 months later, in a suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel. "But only if you understand something. I am not marrying Tyrone Power the actor. I am marrying the descendant of Irish kings. Do you still have the family crest?" He laughed. Then he saw her face. "You're serious?" "I have never been more serious in my life." The wedding and the warning. They married on January 27, 1949, in a civil ceremony in Santa Monica, because Linda refused to marry in a church until she had converted to Catholicism, a conversion she promised Power she would complete but never did. The press called it the wedding of the year. The studio called it a publicity dream. Linda's mother called it a good start. The reception was at the Bel Air home of David Niven, who had known Power since they were struggling actors together. Niven's wife, Primula, pulled Linda aside as the champagne was poured. "You know he's fragile," Primula said. "You know he needs more than a beautiful woman. He needs a nurse." Linda smiled her most impenetrable smile. "I am not a nurse. I am a countess in waiting." Primula shook her head. "Then you will both drown." For a few years, it seemed they would not. They bought a house in Holmby Hills, a 16-room Georgian revival with a ballroom and a tennis court. Linda redecorated it in the style of a French chateau: silk walls, crystal chandeliers, a dining table that seated 24. She hired a staff of 7, including a butler who had worked for the Duke of Windsor. She threw parties that lasted until dawn, parties attended by the Aga Khan, by Gloria Swanson, by the Countess of Durham. Power went along with it, at first. He loved Linda's ambition. It was so different from Annabella's quiet dissatisfaction. He loved the way Linda could enter a room and make every other woman feel underdressed. He loved the way she called him my lord in private, a joke that became a habit that became a need. But he did not love the bills. The silk walls cost $60,000. The chandeliers cost $40,000. The butler's salary was more than Power's first film contract. And Linda had no interest in economies. When Power suggested they sell the tennis court, she looked at him as if he had suggested they sell her mother. "Tyrone," she said, "we are not common people." "We are actors," he said. "That's exactly what we are." The cracks appear. The first crack came in 1951, when Power was offered the role of Hamlet on stage in New York. It was his dream, the role he had wanted since drama school. Linda did not oppose it, exactly. But she made clear that she would not accompany him to New York for the full run. She had parties to host. She had invitations to accept. She had a position to maintain. "You're choosing a dinner party over my Hamlet," Power said one night, his voice quiet in a way that frightened her. "I'm choosing our life," she said. "You chose the stage. I chose this house. Don't ask me to be someone else." He went to New York alone. He stayed in a small apartment near the theater, eating deli sandwiches and learning to be a prince of Denmark. Linda stayed in Holmby Hills, throwing a party for the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who were passing through Los Angeles on their endless exile. The Duke, the same man who had abdicated an empire for love, danced with Linda until 3 in the morning and told her she was the most exquisite creature in America. The next morning, Power called from New York. He had heard about the party from a gossip columnist. "The Duke of Windsor," he said. "You danced with the Duke of Windsor while I was here, alone, trying to find the ghost of my father?" "He's a very good dancer," Linda said. Power hung up. He did not call back for 3 days. When he returned to Los Angeles, he was different. Not colder, exactly, but more distant. He looked at Linda as if she were a painting he had once loved but could no longer afford. They stopped sleeping in the same room. They stopped eating dinner together. They began a dance of separate schedules, separate friends, separate lives. Linda tried to save it. She flew to Rome with Power when he filmed the Roman conquest. She posed for photographs with him at the Vatican, at the Spanish Steps, at a dinner given by the Princess of Naples. She wore her most beautiful gowns, smiled her most radiant smiles. But when the cameras were off, Power retreated into silence. "You don't love me," he said one night in their hotel room. "You love the idea of loving me." "That's the same thing," Linda said. "No," he said. "It's the opposite." The divorce and the lesson. The divorce was finalized in 1955. It was, by Hollywood standards, amicable. Power gave Linda the Holmby Hills house as part of the settlement, plus a generous monthly allowance. Linda gave Power his freedom and kept the title of Tyrone, Power's ex-wife, a title she wore like a jewel. But privately, she was devastated. Not because she had lost Power. She had lost him long before the papers were signed. She was devastated because the marriage had not given her what she wanted. She had married an Irish nobleman, or the closest thing Hollywood could produce, and she had still not been invited to the right houses in Europe. She was still Linda Christian, actress, not Linda Christian, princess. She sat in her ballroom the night after the divorce was announced, alone, in the dark, wearing a satin robe and drinking cognac from a crystal glass. The chandeliers glittered. The silk walls whispered. And Linda Christian, who had moved among nobles and danced with dukes, realized something terrible. She had spent her whole life trying to enter a room that did not want her. "Then I will build my own room," she said aloud, to no one. And she did. But the room she built was not made of silk and crystal. It was made of debt and delusion and a hunger that would never be fed. The European years, the slow unraveling, and the tragic end. The morning after the divorce papers were signed, Linda Christian woke before dawn and walked through her Holmby Hills mansion one room at a time. She touched the silk walls in the ballroom. She ran her fingers along the crystal chandelier in the dining room. She stood in the master bedroom, empty now, Tyrone's clothes gone, his side of the closet a hollow cave, and she felt something she had never expected to feel. She felt relief. Not because she was glad the marriage was over, but because she no longer had to pretend. For 7 years, she had played the role of Hollywood's first lady of nobility. She had hosted dukes and princes and fading countesses. She had worn Dior and Balenciaga and jewels she could not afford. And through it all, she had known a secret that she never told a living soul. She was bored. Not with Tyrone. With the pretense. With the performance of being a great lady when she was, at heart, a girl from Tampico who preferred tequila to champagne and secretly loved American jazz more than Viennese waltzes. The nobility had accepted her, but only as a curiosity. She was the actress who married the movie star. She was never the movie star who became a princess. The titles, she wrote years later in a fragment of an unpublished memoir, are just costumes. And I have worn so many costumes that I no longer remember what I look like without one. The flight to Europe. She sold the Holmby Hills house in 1956 for a fraction of what she had spent on it. The silk walls peeled before the sale. The chandelier had lost 3 crystals. The tennis court was cracked and overgrown. She took the money, just under $200,000, most of it already owed to creditors, and she did the only thing that made sense. She fled to Europe. Not as a tourist. Not as an exile. As a woman returning to a world that had never truly been hers but that she understood better than any place on earth. She rented a small apartment in Paris, on the left bank, above a bookstore that smelled of old paper and regret. She told the gossip columnists she was researching a film. She told her mother she was resting. She told herself she was starting over. For a few months, she almost believed it. Paris in the late 1950s was a city of ghosts and glories. The war was a decade past, but the wounds were still fresh. The old aristocracy had returned to their crumbling chateaux, their depleted vineyards, their titles that no longer opened doors. Linda moved among them like a nurse on a battlefield. She knew exactly what they needed, someone to remind them that they had once mattered. She became a fixture at the dinners of the Comtesse de Maigret, a tiny woman with a cage of white hair and a memory that stretched back to the Belle Époque. She danced at the parties of the Baron de Ried, whose apartment on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré was a museum of forgotten luxuries. She attended the soirees of Marie-Laure Denos, the surrealist patroness who had known Dali and Buñuel and had the scars to prove it. And she met them. The princes. The pretenders. The men with names that weighed more than their bank accounts. Prince Igor, the dancer who could not stay. The first was Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian émigré, a former Olympic skier, a man whose nose had been broken by life and whose heart had been broken by women even more ambitious than Linda. He was tall, lean, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that comes from losing everything and deciding not to care. They met at a party in Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat, a villa owned by an American heiress who collected noblemen the way other women collected handbags. Igor was standing by the bar, drinking vodka neat, staring at the Mediterranean as if he expected it to apologize. "You look like a man who has lost a kingdom," Linda said, using the same line she had used on Tyrone Power 8 years earlier. Igor turned. He looked at her for a long time. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I have lost 3 kingdoms. But I have also lost 3 wives. The kingdoms I miss less." They became lovers within a week. They traveled together to Venice, to Rome, to the Amalfi Coast. Igor taught her to ski in Gstaad, even though she hated the cold. She taught him to dance the mambo, even though he had no rhythm. For 2 years, they lived in a haze of hotel suites and borrowed yachts and the quiet desperation of 2 people who had both been beautiful for too long. But Igor was not a man who could stay. He had been born restless, the son of a prince who had fled the Russian Revolution with nothing but a pair of dueling pistols and a grudge. He loved Linda, perhaps as much as he could love anyone, but he loved movement more. He left her in 1959, in a hotel room in Rome, with a note that said only, "You deserve someone who can stand still. I am not that man." Linda kept the note. She kept it for 23 years, folded inside her copy of Proust, because she believed, superstitiously, romantically, foolishly, that the note was a promise. If Igor could not stand still, then she would learn to move with him. But he never came back. Baron von Pantz, the glass eye and the golden lies. Then came Baron Hubert von Pantz. He was Austrian, 57 years old when Linda met him in 1960, a man who wore his loneliness like a medal. His left eye was glass, lost in a hunting accident in the Tyrone in 1934, and he had a habit of tilting his head when he listened, as if he were trying to hear the world with his missing eye. The Baron claimed to own a castle in Styria, a vineyard in the Wachau, and a painting by Klimt that his grandmother had received as a wedding gift. Linda believed all of it. She wanted to believe all of it. Because the Baron offered her something that Igor never could, a title. A real title. Not a Russian princely claim that had been disputed since 1917, but an Austrian barony, intact, recognizable, legitimate. They were engaged within 6 months. Linda announced it to the press with a photograph of herself wearing the Baron's ring, a large emerald set in yellow gold, which she later discovered was paste. She did not cancel the engagement. She doubled down. "The Baron is a man of honor," she told a reporter from Paris Match. "The value of a ring is not in the stone. It is in the promise." But the Baron's promises were as hollow as his emerald. The castle in Styria had been confiscated by the Austrian government after the war. The vineyard in the Wachau had been sold to pay gambling debts. The Klimt, if it had ever existed, was long gone. The Baron lived on the kindness of women and the opacity of Swiss bank accounts. Linda learned the truth on a rainy afternoon in Vienna, when a lawyer showed her the Baron's credit records. She read them in silence, then looked up at the lawyer, a thin man with spectacles and a kind face, and said, "How much does he owe?" "More than you have, madam," the lawyer said. "And less than you deserve." She broke the engagement that night. The Baron wept. Linda did not. She had learned, finally, that tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. The daughters and the distance. Through all of this, the princes, the barons, the false rings and true disappointments, Linda had two daughters who watched from the sidelines. Romina, born in 1951, and Tyrone, born in 1953, were the children of her marriage to Tyrone Power. They were beautiful, bright, and already accustomed to their mother's absences. Linda loved them. There is no question of that. She loved them with the fierce, possessive love of a woman who had been abandoned by her own father and was determined to never repeat the pattern. But she did repeat it, just in a different key. She sent them to boarding schools in Switzerland and England, the same schools she had attended as a girl. She visited them between trips to Paris and Rome, between princes and barons, between the parties that never ended and the come-downs that always did. She wrote them letters on hotel stationery, long letters full of kisses and regrets and promises to do better. "Please come home," Romina wrote when she was 13. "I don't care about the parties. I don't care about the titles. I just want to see you eat breakfast." Linda kept that letter, too. She kept it in the same Proust volume, next to Igor's note. But she did not go home. Because she was no longer sure where home was. By 1965, Romina and Tyrone had stopped expecting their mother to be present. They had become their own women, Romina with her voice and her songs, Tyrone with her quiet intelligence and her determination to never become an actress. They loved Linda, but they loved her the way you love a natural disaster, from a safe distance. The 1970s, the decade of disappearing. The 1970s were not kind to Linda Christian. They were not kind to many actresses of her generation, the war babies, the studio system girls, the women who had been told they would be young forever and then woke up one morning with lines around their eyes and no calls from producers. But Linda's decline was steeper than most, because her foundation had always been illusion. She moved back to the United States in 1971, not because she wanted to, but because she could no longer afford Europe. The dollar had fallen. The francs had risen. The barons had stopped calling. She rented a small apartment in New York, on the Upper East Side, in a building full of widows and divorcees who had once been someone. She tried to work. She appeared in a few television shows, Love, American Style, an episode of The Streets of San Francisco, playing washed-up actresses and forgotten socialites. The roles did not require acting. They required her to show up and be herself. She wrote a memoir, or tried to. The manuscript was rejected by 7 publishers. "Too sad," one editor wrote in the margins. "Too much champagne and not enough truth," wrote another. Linda burned the manuscript in her fireplace on a cold January night. "If they don't want the truth," she told her cat, a mangy Persian she had named Prince Igor, "then I will give them nothing." But she could not give nothing. She was Linda Christian. She had moved among nobles. She had danced with dukes. She had been married to the most beautiful man in Hollywood. She could not simply disappear. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She dressed up. Every night, whether or not she had anywhere to go, she put on a gown and gloves and pearls. She powdered her face, painted her lips, curled her hair. She sat in her apartment, alone, and waited for the phone to ring. It did not ring. In 1979, Linda moved to Tyrone, California, a small, wealthy town across the bay from San Francisco. Her daughter, Romina, had bought her a small apartment above a garage. It was not the Holmby Hills mansion. It was not a Parisian penthouse. But it had a view of the water, and the fog reminded her of the English countryside, and the neighbors did not ask questions. Linda told the neighbors she was writing a novel. She told the mailman she was a retired diplomat's wife. She told the grocery store clerk that she had once been engaged to a prince. The clerk nodded and bagged her groceries, a bottle of cheap white wine, a baguette, some brie that was past its expiration date but still edible. Her health began to fail in 1980. First, the arthritis in her hands, the same hands that had worn the Cartier watch, the emerald ring, the pearls from the Saudi prince. Then, the cough that would not go away. Then, the pain in her abdomen that she ignored until she could not ignore it anymore. She was diagnosed with colon cancer in the spring of 1981. She did not tell her daughters. She did not tell her friends, the few who remained. She told no one because she had spent her entire life being seen, and she could not bear to be seen like this, thin, pale, her hair falling out, her beautiful face a mask of pain. She underwent chemotherapy at a small hospital in San Rafael. The treatments made her sicker than the disease. She lost 40 pounds. She lost her hair. She lost her appetite for the champagne she had once drunk by the case. But she never lost her gowns. They hung in her closet, preserved in plastic, a museum of who she had once been. Every morning, she opened the closet and ran her fingers over the silk and chiffon and velvet. She did not wear them. She could not. Her body had betrayed her. But she needed to see them, to touch them, to remember. The last party. On July 21, 1982, Linda Christian knew she was dying. Not because a doctor told her. The doctors had been saying she had months, maybe longer, for over a year. She knew because she woke up and felt nothing. No pain. No fear. No hope. Just a vast, quiet emptiness that seemed to stretch from her bed to the horizon. She put on her favorite gown, the white chiffon dress she had worn to the Cannes Film Festival in 1952, the night Prince Rainier had kissed her hand. The dress did not fit. Her body had shrunk. But she put it on anyway, draping it over her shoulders like a shawl. She powdered her face. She painted her lips. She curled what was left of her hair. She sat in her chair by the window, looking out at the bay, the fog rolling in from the Pacific, the boats bobbing gently in the harbor. She poured herself a glass of the cheap white wine. She raised it to the mirror across the room, the mirror that had once reflected a younger, more beautiful woman. "To the party," she said. "Wherever it is." She died sometime in the night. The housekeeper found her the next morning, still in her chair, the wine glass empty, the white chiffon dress slipping from her shoulders. On the table beside her, a framed photograph of Linda at Cannes, 1952, a check for $47.63, and a letter, never mailed, addressed to whoever finds this. I was not a great actress, but I was a great witness. I saw the last moment when beautiful people still wrote letters, still wore gloves, still believed in love as a kind of architecture. After me, everyone became efficient. I am glad I was inefficient. I am glad I was late to every appointment. I am glad I chose the wrong men. It made the right rooms so much more interesting. Do not weep for me. I had champagne and caviar and the hands of princes. Most people have nothing. I had everything, and then I lost it. That is not a tragedy. That is a life. Tell my daughters I loved them. Tell them I was not cold. I was just looking for a room that did not exist. Farewell. Linda. The funeral and the silence. The funeral was held at Holy Cross Cemetery in Colma, California, on a gray July morning. Fewer than 20 people attended. Romina and Tyrone sat in the front row, holding hands, their faces pale and still. A handful of old Hollywood survivors, actors so forgotten that their names no longer appeared in the trades, sat in the back, muttering to themselves. No studio sent flowers. No prince flew in. Tyrone Power had been dead since 1958, buried in the same cemetery, in a plot far grander than the one Linda would occupy. The Duke of Windsor had died in Paris a decade earlier, his Duchess too frail to travel. The barons and counts and princes had scattered to the four winds, their titles now meaningless, their memories fading. The priest, a young man who had never heard of Linda Christian, read a brief graveside service. He mispronounced her name twice. He called her Blanca instead of Linda. No one corrected him. The headstone is simple. It says, Linda Christian, 1923 to 1982. Beloved Mother. No mention of MGM. No mention of Tyrone Power. No mention of the princes, the barons, the dukes, the duchesses, the glittering parties that had once seemed so important. Just 3 words, Beloved Mother. Romina stayed behind after everyone else had left. She knelt by the grave, her hands in the dirt, and she whispered something that no one else heard. Then she stood, wiped her hands on her skirt, and walked away. The legend that remains. But here is the strange thing about Linda Christian, she did not disappear. In the years after her death, her legend grew, not because of her films, which are largely forgotten, but because of her life. She became a symbol of something that Hollywood had lost, the willingness to be inefficient, to be late, to choose the wrong men, to value beauty over practicality. Young actresses, discovering her story in old biographies and gossip columns, began to mention her as an influence. She didn't care about being respected, said one. She cared about being remembered. And she was right. On certain foggy afternoons in Tiburon, locals claimed to see an elderly woman in a white chiffon dress walking toward the bay. Her feet are bare. Her hair is undone. She walks slowly, deliberately, as if she has all the time in the world. She's going to a party, the old-timers say. And they smile, because they know the party is long over, but they also know that Linda Christian would not care. She was not a great actress, but she was a great witness. And witnesses, even flawed ones, are never truly forgotten.